And we welcome back David Wilson, Professor of Celtic Studies and History at the University of Toronto and author of Thomas D'Arcy McGee, Volumes 1 and 2. Hello again.
Hello.
Okay, so you write 2 volumes on Thomas D'Arcy McGee, about 1,000 pages all told, and 50 words or less. Tell me who he was.
He was a one-time Irish revolutionary and Republican who wound up as a liberal, conservative Father of Confederation, and in the process took on revolutionary extremists within his own Irish Catholic community and was assassinated as a result.
That's pretty good. Pretty good. Okay, McGee's born in Ireland, he moves to the United States, and then he comes to Canada. What brings him here?
He came to Canada because he had become progressively disillusioned with the United States. As an Irish Catholic who was in the United States in the post-famine period, when there were a lot of impoverished Irish immigrants in the US, he'd witnessed the full force of American Protestant anti-Catholic nativism. He'd seen priests beaten up on the streets. He'd seen his own countrymen trapped in urban ghettos, mired in poverty. And he associated the values of the United States with materialism, individualism, corruption, celebrity culture, guns on the street, free love, you name it. It was too permissive and too dangerous. He had 3 children at this time. And as he became disillusioned with the situation facing Irish Catholics in the States, he increasingly turned his attention northwards. And he found, or thought he found, in Canada, a society in which Catholics could breathe much more easily on the streets. And this was largely because of the French fact, because French Canadian Catholics had so much political influence, they were able to protect the educational rights of English-speaking Catholics in Canada.
You know, Canadians in the 1850s and 60s didn't support multiculturalism as they do today. Is there an incident from that time that really sort of exposes a religious tension that existed during McGee's time?
Yes, I wouldn't actually agree entirely with the premise of the question, because there were many Canadians, like McGee, who emphasized the importance of each ethno-religious group bringing out the best in itself and bringing out the best in others through a process of mutual accommodation and compromise and brokerage. And actually one of the main reasons why McGee and others felt that way was precisely because there was a danger of such ethno-religious divisions ripping the country apart. And there was plenty of evidence for those who feared that would happen. In Toronto, for example, in 1858, St. Patrick's Day, there was a riot between Orange men who wanted to bust up the parade and Catholics in the parade. A young man, Matthew Sheedy, was stabbed to death. Later that night at the National Hotel, an orange crowd attacked the Catholic diners and actually wrecked the windows. Shots were fired. The police force in Toronto, most of whom were Orange men, all looked the other way and were unable to recognize a single rioter outside the hotel.
Remind us who the Orange men are.
Sure. The Orange men were immensely important in 19th and early 20th century Canadian history. In fact, they were the single most important contribution that Ireland made to Canada. They were Protestant, they were ultra-loyalist, strong supporters of the Crown, and fiercely anti-Catholic.
And McGee himself is a Catholic. And I want to just back up a sec, because he had a real issue with the Fenians. And we were talking earlier today about how are we going to describe who the Fenians are. And some people said, well, they're extremists. And others said, well, you know, they're fighting for Ireland's independence. And so here's McGee, who found them extraordinarily dangerous. Why do you find the Fenians so dangerous?
Yeah, as you suggest, we need to define Fenianism. And in the most general sense, it's supporters of a separate, republican, independent Ireland, and supporters who are prepared to use physical force to get there. And within that movement, there are many different shadings and many different groups. But McGee took an absolutely confrontational approach towards them. He felt that they were extremely dangerous on many levels. In Ireland, he thought the prospects for revolution was zero. Therefore, to aim for revolution was to invite a backlash that would prevent reforms from ever occurring. In Canada, he believed that if Catholics became associated with Fenians, there would be a huge Protestant and Orange backlash against Catholics in general. They'd all be tarred with the Fenian brush. They would never get employment. They would never get equality. So he also felt, given those assumptions, that the only way you could challenge Fenianism, and remember he had once been a revolutionary Republican himself, so he knew the appeal, he'd felt it himself. The only way you could challenge it was by polarizing the situation, confronting the Fenians, no compromise, no equivocation. You polarize, you marginalize, you isolate, and you defeat. And as it turned out, that strategy backfired on him.
We're going to talk about how it backfired in a minute. But, you know, at the same time, Irish Catholics in Canada thought McGee spent too much time trying to appease Protestants. He himself, a Catholic, trying to appease Protestants, specifically the Orange Order. You know, why was McGee so tough on them? Do you buy that?
Well, some accused McGee of doing that, and more as his career progressed. And I think for McGee, it was essential for Irish Catholics to demonstrate their loyalty. I mean, here was a country in which Irish Catholics had got everything they wanted, really. I mean, they were free from a privileged, established Protestant church. They were free from the tyranny of landlords. They were much better off in Canada than they were back in Ireland. So they had religious freedom, they had much more political freedom, they had much more economic prosperity. If Irish Catholics are disloyal in this environment, then you're in big trouble. But on the other hand, if he can demonstrate that they are indeed loyal to the British Empire when they are treated fairly and reasonably, that's a great argument for reform back in Ireland as well.
He really lived an extraordinary life, 42 years old, and all that he did in that time in 3 countries is quite amazing. But his call for religious tolerance that you speak of, ended in his death. Tell me about how he was killed.
It wasn't so much his call for religious tolerance that ended in his death as his direct confrontation with the Fenians. And he'd become the archetypal hate figure, the Emmanuel Goldstein of the Fenian movement, because he was the traitor in their view. He was someone who had once been a Fenian in all but name. He had once supported an Irish-based revolution in Canada. He'd proudly described himself as a traitor to the British government when he arrived in the United States in 1848. Now here he was in the cabinet as a minister of agriculture, immigration, and statistics, hobnobbing with orange men like John A. Macdonald. Moderate orange men, maybe, but orange men nonetheless. And so from the point of view of Fenians, he had betrayed them, and he betrayed them on the altar of his own personal ambition. And the penalty for treason is death. So he got many, many death threats as he took on the Fenians. And because of his confrontational approach, his take no prisoners approach, if you like, to the Fenians, he generated, not within most Irish Catholics, it's very important to make that point, but within a minority of Irish Catholics, intense hostility.
And ultimately, he's coming home one evening from the House of Commons to the boarding house where he's staying on Spark Street in Ottawa, and he gets a bullet in the head or in the back or whatever, and he dies. Who killed him?
That's still hotly contested, and we'll never know for sure. The man who was arrested and tried, convicted, and executed was Patrick James Whelan. Now, I am convinced that Whelan was a Fenian. I think there's a lot of evidence to suggest that. That, of course, does not make him the assassin. There were many other Fenians. But there was a lot of incriminating evidence, including forensic evidence, a gun in his possession. He was arrested the day of the murder. A gun in his possession had been fired 48 hours, within the previous 48 hours. There were many witnesses who came forward and said he had a pattern of death threats against McGee. So the jury decided, oh, and also a policeman said, or actually did, overhear him in the cell saying, "I'm a great fellow. I'll go down in posterity. I shot that bugger like a dog."
And Whelan's convicted and hanged ultimately.
That's right. And he always claimed that he was innocent. But the night before he was hanged, he said that he knew who shot McGee and that he was there when McGee was shot.
Do you think he killed him?
I think he either shot McGee or he was part of a hit squad that did.
You know, that's an unknown story, the details. It's fascinating when you read about what happened and the trial and it played out. And McGee, you know, was one of 30-odd men that are fathers of Confederation, and yet we know, well, not very much about him. So he's a major player then, but is he a major player when it comes to the real formation of Canada?
In many ways, yes. In some ways, no. He wasn't directly involved in most of the negotiations at Charlottetown and Quebec that culminated in Confederation, except for the issue of minority rights in education. He played a large part in securing minority educational rights in Canada, and he was extremely proud of that. More generally, his other contributions were to act as the social convener of Confederation. He was the one Canadian-based politician who knew the Maritimes well. He'd been out there several times. And so he was able to introduce maritime politicians to Canadian politicians. Also, he was a brilliant orator and speechwriter, and his speeches and lectures in favor of Confederation weren't particularly original in their arguments, but no one could surpass him in the style with which he presented those views.
Some 150, 60 years later, when you think of Thomas D'Arcy McGee and you look at Canada as it is today, has his vision of Canada been realized?
In some ways. In other ways, he would have been absolutely horrified by life in Canada. Well, you have to remember that the past is a foreign country and they do things differently there. I mean, it was a very different world. Like all Catholic MPs in Canada in the 1850s and 60s, he was strongly opposed to divorce under any circumstances whatsoever. As for abortion, I mean, that was heinous and unthinkable. So, you know, if you plucked him out of that environment and put him down now, those things would absolutely horrify him. On the other hand, the emphasis on multiculturalism would, I think, he would see as a vindication of his own views, where people can combine their own identities as immigrants or members of an ethnic group while being part of a larger Canadian entity, and that you can't just make a priori rules about what it is to be a Canadian. It's a process. It's a process of interaction among different ethnic groups. And ideally, it's a process in which, as I say, they bring out the best in themselves and bring out the best in the others. That's why he was so opposed to extremism on both sides. Orangism militant Orangism on the one hand and Fenianism on the other, because he believed that those extremes could wreck the kind of country and destroy the kind of polity in which he believed so strongly. I think he would be very concerned about similar patterns among some ethnic groups in Canada today, and he would admire those politicians who are doing now what he did then, taking them on.
Briefly tell me who you're talking about.
We're talking about people like Usal Dosanjh and his campaign against militant Sikh nationalism, which took great moral courage.
And Tariq Fatah,
and Tariq Fatah as well, yes. And I think McGee would have identified with individuals like that. And I think, I don't know the extent to which they know about McGee, but I think if they read about McGee, they would identify with McGee as well.
They might know more about it if you'd watched the show tonight's show. Thank you very much, David Wilson. A fascinating book, and definitely next time in Ottawa, D'Arcy McGee pub, I'll raise a glass to the man. Thank you.
Thank you very much.